Right, we're back. Now, first thing I want to show you isn't from that 1716, 1776 closure period. It's actually a bit earlier. You do get pieces of York silver made by goldsmiths during that 1697, 1701 to 2 period, where the Assay Office has been closed down by Act of Parliament because in London they've introduced the Britannia Standard, and that hasn't been allowed in the provinces, and they correct that mistake and Britannia Standard comes in. But for a period, goldsmiths are still working but unable to assay pieces. So often they develop their own system of hallmarking. Now remember, at York, it was typical for there to be 3 marks on a piece of silver: the maker's mark, the standard mark, which is the crowned leopard's head and the half fleur-de-lis, and the date letter. The pieces I've seen of this period, which are largely spoons, tend to be struck with the York maker's mark only 3 times. It's the only punch they had, but the key thing here is they struck it 3 times because you would expect to see 3 marks on a piece of York silver of this period. In London, when things are not sent for assay, for not because the Assay Office is closed, but for sort of clandestine or peculiar reasons, they will strike a maker's mark 4 times because you expect to see 4 marks on a piece of London silver of that period: the maker's mark, the London town mark, the standard mark, and the date letter. There is also some confusion with American colonial silver, but American colonial silver has a quirk, not always, but it has a quirk that they usually strike the maker's mark twice. This is not a firm rule, but it is a guide. If you are looking at a piece of late 17th, early 18th century silver, which you believe to be English, it only has a maker's mark on it, and it is struck 3 times, there is a good chance that it is from York. Now, this spoon is something of a curiosity and an oddity, and in normal circumstances, even when I first saw this, I said to the person that had it, I said, well, that's not York. It doesn't feel like York, it doesn't look like York, and it's caused a lot of debate amongst spoon people who've said it's foreign. It is not a continental spoon, I can promise you that. They are. It's very much an English provincial spoon. It is. It does have some peculiar features. It's quite a sharp curve here to the stem. It's quite a broad dog nose. But interestingly, and the reason why the person that had it persuaded me it was possibly York, was that these marks, which is a maker's mark twice and a device mark, and in this case a fleur-de-lis. And remember, even though fleur-de-lis occur as odd marks all over the country, half a fleur-de-lis was the York town mark. So there's a correlation there. If you're trying to make your own punch, you might choose to do a crowned leopard, but you might think that's very London, so you might decide just to do a fleur-de-lis. And the fact it's an incuse punch as well suggests it's very much fashioned by the goldsmith that was making the spoon, not an official punch. 2 initials, II. These marks are recorded on one other piece of silver that we know of, and it is a communion dish, and it was presented, it's inscribed as a presentation in 1706 to Goodramgate Church in York. The telling thing about church silver is it tends almost always to be locally made. There are odd instances where much earlier pieces of silver that are made elsewhere are given because they are redundant to churches. But if it's contemporary, and remember this pattern, this dog nose pattern, is very much contemporary with that date, you would think that it was actually ordered from a local goldsmith. Now, 1706 is not too far away if it had been inscribed a couple of years later from the 1697 to 1701-2 period where there was no official assay at York. What's most telling, though, is we do have a record of a Mr. Jones, who was a goldsmith at York. We don't have a recorded mark for him, but we know that he was prosecuted by the London Goldsmiths Company for selling substandard wares in 1700. So what's the surname on this? Initial I, or J, as it would have been written. There is a very strong case that this is Mr. Jones of York. It's not definitive by any means, unfortunately. If it were, this would be possibly the rarest piece of York silver that you could ever wish to find, the only spoon by this maker known. And it would be worth, you know, many, many, many thousands of pounds. As it is, it's a very interesting and rare provincial spoon with all those York associations, and it's still a valuable thing and a rare thing. But that, just wanted to cover that to explain this earlier period, this 4 or 5 year period, where York silver is found without town marks, but it has a maker's mark repeated. And the reason I've done that is because we are now going to talk about this. This is what you would hope to find a typical York tumbler cup. They're called tumbler cups, if no one's seen one, because they have slightly rounded bottoms. So, I mean, it does tip over, but the idea is if it's got liquid in it and it's rolling about, it won't fall over. I don't know how practical that is. This was in a specialist silver sale about 12, 15 years ago. Everybody saw it. It was described as an unascribed tumbler cup, thankfully. Some 10 years before this came to auction, a spoon, a fully marked York Treffid spoon, came up at auction. It was with Bonhams in Chester. Sadly, Bonhams Chester is no longer with us. And I just took 5 minutes. I didn't buy the spoon. I couldn't possibly afford it. But I just took 5 minutes to copy a picture of the marks that were in the catalogue and paste them into my large book of hallmarks to make a note that this was a new maker's mark I hadn't seen anywhere else, and thought no more about it. 10 years later, when this turned up with just a maker's mark on the bottom and one maker's mark, not three, one maker's mark on the bottom, I recognised it immediately. It is the mark of Timothy Plummer of York and nowhere else. And this threw up the interesting question, why does it just have Timothy Plummer's mark on it struck once? Timothy Plummer was free as a goldsmith in 1688 and he died in 1740. So he was working, he was at his height when the York Assay Office closed in 1716. He was not producing an array of wares, but because very little has come down with his mark, but he was a manufacturing goldsmith. He did not enter an arrangement with Newcastle to send his wares for assay. He just reverted to striking his maker's mark once on the base of the cup. You might also say, from the positioning of that punch, because it is off-centre, that it was made just as the Assay Office closed in 1716, because he was also allowing for the other marks to be put in, because often that's how they're assayed, these little tumbler cups, in a circle on the base. But it's absolutely telling that this is now, in this period, how York silversmiths working at York, unofficially, without an assay office, mark their wares. They put one maker's mark on the base. Now, only a month ago, another one of these tumbler cups came up at auction by another York goldsmith who was incorrectly, I don't blame the auctioneers for this, incorrectly identified as another York goldsmith. It is written in the large book that we have as being the mark of John Thompson, but it does have a question mark after it. And it was dated to 1680. Actually, it was another of these much rarer sort of pieces made when there was no assay office in York. It was actually by a goldsmith. I mean, I underbid it. I'm bitterly sad to say I underbid it. Somebody nicked it off me. It cost £2,500. I think that was a bargain, whoever bought it, so well done. It's actually most likely by the York goldsmith, James Todd. So if you have it, you have a very rare James Todd tumbler cup, but it doesn't date to the 1680s. It dates from this later period, post 1716, probably up to about 1720. You wouldn't expect to see this form. It's a gorgeous thing, beautifully made. There's nowhere to hide with a piece of plain silver. When you make decorative things, you can chase them, and you can disguise any flaws or imperfections in your hammering and planishing. But when it's plain, you have nowhere to hide. It has to be perfect. So this is the sort of thing. This is extremely rare. Extremely rare. Anything of this period, 1716 through the middle of the 18th century at York, we are counting things globally on the fingers of one hand. So, which is why I was so devastated not to get that other tumbler cup. But never mind. Right, we're up to 11 minutes again. Part 3 coming in a moment.